Welcome to the Sports Ethics Podcast. The Sports Ethics Podcast discusses the many ethical and philosophical issues that arise in and around sport. I am Sean Klein, the sports ethicist. You can read the Sports Ethicist blog at sportsethicist.com, where you can also download podcasts of previous shows, subscribe to the podcast, or find links to related information. The Sports Ethicist is also on Facebook and Twitter, and you can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. Today is October 22nd, 2014, and my guest today is Dr. Joan Forry. Dr. Forry earned her PhD in philosophy from Temple University in 2008, where she wrote her dissertation entitled The Gender Politics of Contemporary Sport, Ethics, Power, and the Body. She has regularly taught courses in sports ethics, sports philosophy, as well as animal ethics. And she and her Chihuahua Paloma do dog agility at times. So welcome back to the show, Joan.
Hi, thanks for having me, Sean.
Glad to have you back on. Our last podcast was on women playing football. So today's topic is a little different.
A little bit different.
A little different. Our focus is on animal sports, and it's based off a paper you're working on for my forthcoming book, our forthcoming anthology on defining sport. And so it raises some issues about defining sport and defining a sport in a way that might take account of animals who are involved in these kind of competitions. And in this paper that you're working on, you raise several interesting questions. You ask, are competitions involving non-human animals like horse racing, dog agility, and so on, is it right to really think of these as sport, and and how so? And if they are sport, under what conditions are animal sports morally justifiable, right? And are there conditions where they would not be justifiable? So I wanted to start with the first question first. That always is a good place to start. And so, are animal competitions, are these sport?
Some of them are. So the angle that I try to take in the paper is to look at the concept of play, which features very prominently in a lot of attempts at defining what sport is. And I'm looking at animals playing in these sporting contexts, or what we would call sporting contexts, in which animals and non-human animals compete with or against each other. And I'm looking at this question of whether the animals are indeed engaging in play. So I've set it up so that there's, if they are engaging in play, then we might be able to consider that activity a sport. However, there are lots of different examples of animals in competition,
right,
and what we call sports. And so what I'm trying to do is say that some of them can be considered sports, others do not meet this voluntary play condition and therefore are just not sports.
Okay. Yeah, and another thing I like in the taxonomy that you do is so you have this sort of not sport and sport, but then also a good example of it as sport and a bad example of it as sport, which I think is important to do, because it reminds me of discussions that come up about art.
Yes.
And some people who want to define art in a way that defines out bad art and say, well, that's not really art because it's bad, and it doesn't seem quite right. I mean, it seems like there's some things that are art and some things that aren't, and then in the category of things that are art, some are bad examples of art,
yes.
and some are good examples. And so I think I like the way I like your approach there in terms of that kind of breakdown of the concept. So the definition of sport, or the conception of sport that we're working with, is tied into play. And this is, for those who are familiar with philosophy of sport, they know that this is a big issue, right? What is play? How does it connect to sport? They have the whole what's his name, Bernard Suits and Klaus Meyer argument about this, and the so-called tricky triad, which is this relationship between play, sport, and games, which there will also be an essay in the book defining sport on that, just as another sort of plug for a book that's more than a year away. But so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between play, because not all play is going to count as sport. So even if animals are playing, it seems like we still would want something else present or identifiable, recognizable to move to from animal playing to animal sport. So um, what is the connection of sport to play here that you're thinking of, and then how do we bring in animals into it? If that question makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it does make sense, and I think that the same mechanisms that we use to try to figure out what constitutes human sport, and those same criteria can be used to analogously decide what counts as animal sports, for example. So let's say that I'm out with my dog and I'm playing a game with him. I'm playing tug of war, for example.
Right.
So my big dog loves to play tug of war. And so we have the toy and we're playing and he's tugging and I'm moving around and doing all this fun stuff with him.
Right.
Now, there are rules that we engage in when we play tug of war. And these are rules that he had to learn when he was quite young, that if he accidentally bit my hand, the game was over.
Right.
And he learned pretty quickly that, oh gosh, if I want to keep playing, and playing is really fun and tug is a really great game, I have to be really careful and not accidentally grab any hands.
Right. My dog
But
never learned
that's
that rule.
oh really.
She
But while
has she hasn't really learned any rules, I think.
we're
That's my fault though.
that's a game that we play, but it's not a sport because it's not really, even though there are rules and even though we're engaging in it in a playful way in this practice, there's no culture surrounding it. We don't have a sense of community that sort of has an agreed upon um, parameters of competition or anything like that when we're engaging in tug with this, this game that I play with my dog. So
Sorry to interrupt, but
let's.
we have play, voluntary play as a part of the concept. We have rules,
Mhm.
the sort of game-like structure, and then a third thing for sport would be the idea of a culture, an institution, a set of practices or history to it that kind of governs aspects of the previous parts of the concept. Is that a way to think
Yes.
about it? Okay,
Yes. I
good.
have a great example of this. There's a new dog sport called barn hunt.
Barn hunt?
Barn hunt,
Okay.
yes. And this is so what it is you it typically takes place in a barn, but and there's
That makes sense.
yes. And they set up obstacles with hay bales.
Okay.
So and they will hide. They'll put a rat in a PVC tube, so the rat is, and it's like enclosed, so the rat is protected. But the dog has to sniff out where the rat is hidden in the bales of hay.
Okay.
um, and they do it for time. So your dog learns it plays this fun game where it gets to find the scent, and the scent is sort of obscured by the hay and all this stuff. And but whichever dog finds it the fastest and gives the proper signal for alerting, hey, here's the rat, here's the rat, that dog wins the game.
Okay.
And so people bring, they have these barn hunt tournaments where they bring their dogs to compete. And I'm not sure whether we would call it a sport or a game or competition. That's something I need to think a little bit more carefully about because it's quite new.
Okay. Well,
um,
because that's one of the concerns with that aspect of defining
yeah.
sport in terms of having institutions or structure, is is what do you do with new sports? Because
Yeah.
we certainly have new sports, and we have ways of sports developing, and at what and there's a kind of a sortie problem. At what point is there enough of an institution or a
Yes.
culture that it becomes a sport? And it
Yeah.
may just be that there isn't a clear point. It's just okay, now we have enough,
Hmm.
right? And so it's a sport where beforehand it's really just a competition. But I'm a little, I guess I don't want to say skeptical. That's not quite right. I'm a little hesitant to include that as one of the defining characteristics of sport. I mean, I think there's
Yeah.
there's got to be something there to that effect, uh, but it doesn't seem as essential uh, to my way of thinking about sport. Although certainly the established sports have it, but there is this concern about new sports as you're bringing up with this barn hunt example. How at what point does it become a sport if
Yeah.
institution is important? So.
And that's you're exactly right. I tend to be a little bit of a skeptic, hesitant skeptic,
Hmm.
as well, because um, it's you're right. It's not entirely clear what we do with new sports, and that's something I need to get clearer about before I finish the paper that I'm writing for the book. But I I'm I like to look at, I think there's some very clear cases where we do say, oh, that activity where we use animals or we compete with animals in certain ways, it is a sport. And those are some of the activities that I'm looking at in the paper,
Right.
such as horse racing, for example. Though there's lots of criticism surrounding horse racing, we do tend to agree that that is a sport and it meets all of these requirements that we have for defining a sport.
Hmm. So, so to review, we have play, we have the rules, we have something sort of institutional.
Mm-hmm.
Are there more characteristics that we want to put on the table here?
Um, Not at the moment.
Okay, because because
Were you thinking of one in
I,
particular?
I am. I mean the importance of physical skill. Uh,
Oh,
yeah.
yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which you can talk about motor skills, you can talk about hand-eye coordination, you can talk about uh, the fine motor skills versus gross motor skills, and endurance and other aspects. But and not just their presence, not just the fact that you do use certain physical skills and hand-eye coordination, because you could have those, but those might not be relevant uh,
Right.
for it. So the given the nature of the rules of the play, there are ends that you're trying to achieve, and I think something one the boundary between something that's just not just because I don't think there's a I don't want to make a kind of moral or normative claim between these two because I think that competitions that are not sport are just as interesting and just as good, right?
No,
um,
I understand.
yeah.
Yeah.
So and because that's a problem sometimes when you talk about these issues about trying to define sports. Some people are concerned that if you say, well, that's not a sport, that you're saying that that's not as good a thing, or that by somehow calling it a sport, you're praising it more. And I don't want to carry that sort of baggage with it. I'm just trying to carve up things to
Right.
get the concepts right, and then we can evaluate the various competitions. But I mean, because I think of things like something like chess, which
Mm-hmm.
I is a game, is a competition. You play it. There are clear rules. There's an institution around it. I don't think it's a sport because it doesn't have, and certainly hand-eye coordination is important in terms of moving the pieces, but you don't get better at chess by getting better at the physical skills that are involved in playing chess.
Right.
Whereas I think when you talk about sport and athletics, it's the kind of thing that one of the ways you improve is by improving those physical skills and abilities and aspects of it, and that's integral to the test and to what you're doing in the contest, in the competition, or in the play, is sorting out whose physical skills are in some sense superior, or at least superior in that particular competition. And so I think that aspect of the essentiality of physical skills is also part of what's going to make something sport versus something that's a competition but not sport, or something that's a game but not sport. Does what do you think about
I
that aspect of it?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is where this actually points to one of the reasons why I was hesitant to call barn hunt a sport,
Okay.
um, because I mean, yes, clearly. A dog running through a barn and searching for a rat that does take some kind of physical skill. It does take, the dog does have to be able to move and navigate the obstacles. But most importantly, the dog needs to know how to use their nose.
Right.
But this is one of the appeals of barn hunt and scent work, um, nose work activities for dogs, is that dogs who are not particularly physically skilled otherwise
Uh-huh.
can do, and like elderly dogs, or they can do scent work because all they really have to do is use their nose, and be able to correctly identify where a scent is coming from. So it is certainly a competition, but it doesn't require the same kinds of physical skill as, say, a greyhound race or a dog agility competition would.
Yeah, so that's interesting because there is definitely a kind of another threshold problem, which is okay. Well, how much of these physical skills, these abilities that are involved in the sport, or the activity rather, how much do you need before it's enough, right? Because
Yeah,
there's always a
yeah.
little bit, even and this will come up actually in the next podcast I'm doing 2 weeks from now, is on video games as sport and our video games.
Wow, yeah.
And that comes up there too, because certainly there's this, I don't want to get into that too much because we're going to be talking about a lot in 2 weeks, but it's, there does seem to be a threshold issue there where, okay, well, you certainly need to be good at the controller and the fine motor
Hmm.
skills of using the controller and recognizing patterns and hand-eye coordination and being able to see things on the screen and react in a quick enough time, and using your gross motor skills or your fine motor skills with your hands. But then when you get to things like Wii or Connect, and then you're even using, you know, uh,
Yeah.
more of your body. And there's a continuum there, I think, that where at some point, if you're playing, a friend of mine gave me this example, like SimCity or Civilization, that's not going to be counting as a sport because you're not really again, it's what how you get better at it isn't by improving your how well you do the controls, where something uh, maybe like some of the esports, like playing FIFA or something like that, you do have to get better at the movements. I mean, I know when I try to play those, I'm not very good. And when I try to play it and they show a replay, I can usually tell which character I was controlling because he's usually running in the wrong direction. Because I have no idea what I'm doing, and so I got to, and so there, and eh, I understand the game, I understand what I need to do, but there is this component of learning the physical skills, and so I can see that in Barn Hunt maybe something like it's a more narrowed range of physical skills that are being tested
Yes.
and evaluated on. But it does sound, I mean, speed seems to be a part of it based on your
Hmm.
description, and training the nose, their smelling ability to be able to do that seems to be a part of it, right? Am I right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's a, I think, qualifies as a physical skill. So I'm tempted to think of it more as to the extent that we haven't really. I mean, I guess you have answered that there are some things that are sports. We still need to move on to that. But given what you've described, it sounds more like a sport to me than not. Um, so it looks. I'm looking it up now, and there is a barn hunt association now.
Yes, there is.
It does fit. It has an institution. So
Yeah.
so we have play rules, some kind of institutional framework, and as long as we can deal with the sort of new sport issue, and then some some deep connection to physical skills, that these are a significant component of the activity, and actually to some degree even a determiner of the
Yes.
activity. So given that, yeah, it does. It seems like animal some sports could be considered. Some activities involving animals could be considered sport. Now, are there people who want to uh, claim that? Oh, I heard the dog bark.
Yep.
Who was that? Was that Mulligan?
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
Mulligan.
yeah. Hi, Mulligan. And it's not really a podcast unless you hear a dog barking.
Yeah.
And so, are there people who want to dispute that any animal activity can be considered sport, and want to see? Now he's objecting to this. He wants that. Right. So are there people out there like and legitimate scholars and so on, who want to say, or even people involved in these activities who want to say, no, look, sport, athletics, that's reserved for human activities, and not ones that are exclusively or that are animal focused. Do people? Does I haven't ever heard anyone make that argument, so I'm just wondering if you've ever heard anyone say, no, it's not sport because it involves animals. Does anyone make that kind of argument?
um, to be honest, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I have not. Yeah, the short answer is I'm not entirely sure. Um, I am concerned about a certain kind of position that's an animal rights position that sometimes gets um, advanced when we talk about animal athletic activities.
Okay.
So this position argues that we don't have a right to use animals and exploit them, and that to do so through these so-called sporting practices, such as horse racing, it's exploitative. It violates their some sense of non-human agency. It's not in their interests. So we should do away with these activities altogether. And I think that's a pretty gross oversimplification of what is actually happening in a lot of these contexts. There certainly are reasons to be concerned about exploitation and about violating a sense of agency, or not considering the animal's interests. So, so there are good reasons. I mean, there are good reasons to think about those things.
Right.
However, I think just sort of casting all of these activities as a form of exploitation goes too far. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to argue against by
Okay.
teasing out that some of these activities should be considered sport, even if they're and if they're bad examples, then what are some things we can do to make sure they're not bad examples of sport?
Right.
And that some of these activities really are, they do not meet some basic conditions of a sporting practice, such as play. The participants are engaging in voluntary play, then we should get rid of those activities for sure.
Okay. So the animal rights position isn't denying that these can be considered sport, but they're denying that they're saying, well, we shouldn't be engaged in those sports. So right.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a different claim. Um,
Yes, you're right.
and yeah. So and it seems hard. The common sense position does seem to be that they're sport, just like you said. Horse racing, greyhound. We think of these as sport, dog agility, the various other kinds of horse activities. What is that? The various equestrian. Um, what is that called? Dressage. Is that the one?
Dressage.
Dressage. Yeah,
Dressage.
I always say that wrong. And so those activities, we think of them as sport. And they're some of them are in the Olympics. Not that that's a defining characteristic of something being a
True.
sport, but dressage is part of the Olympics, isn't it?
Um,
I think it is part of the Summer Olympics
yeah.
or something like it.
There's some sort of this is terrible. I should know this. Oh, geez. I'm gonna have to look it up. But yes, there are some equestrian sports that are part of the Summer Olympics.
Right, and so we common sense wise, it seems to fit. So it would seem really counterintuitive to try to claim that these aren't sport or just because they involve animals. But so then, with that out of the way, let's move on to the role of play in thinking about sport and um, how this shows us that we can have a space for animal sports. Maybe you could say a little bit about the connection between play and this idea of animal sport.
Um, yeah, so the what I'm trying to set out in the paper is what I call a base condition for voluntary play. So the question that we should be asking pretty constantly is when we're looking at these practices is the animal engaged in play? And if not, what are the reasons for that? And if we want to say the animal is engaged in play, and then that might be a condition for calling a practice a sport, we also have to look at whether the animal is engaged in play for, what are the reasons for the animal to perform the behaviors that we are asking of them. Because when we use techniques in these contexts that involve fear or intimidating the animal or causing pain to the animal, then I think that's a cause for moral concern.
Mm-hmm. So this idea of voluntary, right? That seems like something we need to unpack, uh,
Yeah.
right? Because we need to ask what's the sense of voluntary? Because I could see some people, kind of balking a little bit at talking about animals, or at least some kind of animals, as being voluntary, um, depending on what we mean by voluntary.
Right.
So what do you mean by voluntary then? What's sort of the basic um, idea of voluntary here? Is it just sort of absence of coercion, or some sort of alternative possible actions, or is it something more substantial?
So let me give you an example.
Okay.
So with cockfighting, for
Mm-hmm.
example, people who defend cockfighting will say that the fighting is a natural behavior, that the two roosters will fight over the privilege to mate with all the females. Yes, the fighting is a natural behavior. If you just set a bunch of chickens and roosters out in the woods and let them govern themselves, the roosters would fight for sure. But the problem is, though they might sort of volunteer to fight in that context, they do not fight to the death.
Mm-hmm.
But they commonly fight to the death in cockfighting rings, and that's it. That's one of the reasons it's been so criticized and made illegal in most places.
Right.
Um,
So they're sort of
so if you,
they're operating
yeah,
under a kind of conception of voluntary as kind of just an expression of natural behavior.
yes,
Okay.
yes. Similarly, greyhound racing. So dogs run fast and they chase things because it's fun.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, that's it. It's a fun thing to do. It might be an instinctive behavior. Certainly, sight hounds such as greyhounds are going to chase things that move very quickly, and
Yep.
they are very good at it because we have bred them to be good at that activity.
Right.
So that's what you see dogs volunteering to run fast in play sessions just because it's fun. It's a self-rewarding activity.
Right.
Now, if we would we is that so? I guess the question that we need to be asking as well is we can't clearly put ourselves in the shoes of an animal and say, wow, if I were a dog, this is what I would love to do. These are the things I would like. I mean, we can do that to an extent, but it's not particularly fruitful because we're human beings, and
Right.
it's difficult to imagine what it would be like to be another species. But we do have behavior, and we can observe behavior and read animal behavior well enough that we can tell when the dog doesn't want to do something, or we can tell when an animal is scared or frightened, or is not feeling well, or is in pain. And so those kinds of clues can help us to determine whether an animal is volunteering to continue an activity, and when they're they're not.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question at all, but
I Yeah, I think so. You know, because I think if we were trying to build in or bring in, the a much more robust idea of the voluntary, something that maybe, and maybe even trying to draw a distinction between something like what we might call volition, where we have a more robust idea of forming of intentions and of goals and of making choices about means to achieve those goals in a very purposive sort of way. That seems to involve a lot more levels of cognitive and conceptual abilities that um, that doesn't seem present. Again, that's a controversial claim that doesn't seem present in at least most animals. Now, when we start talking about certainly apes and other mammals, we I think we do see some of that. Um, but when you're talking about chickens, hens, it's part of that is the uh, the sort of what it's like to be a bat problem, right? Because
right, right,
what is it like to be a chicken? No idea, right? Uh,
right.
and so it's hard to know. Well, okay, but we can look at their, from a neuroscience point of view, that the structures of the brain that tend to support, at least in higher mammals, the kind of cognitive and conceptual abilities that humans have. That they don't have those brain structures there, or at least they don't have them in some sufficient degree that we think that can support that kind of ability. And so that begins to at least lend some support to the claim that they don't seem to have those abilities. But so that there's I think a continuum there. But I think if we were trying to require uh, as voluntary for animals to be engaged in voluntary play, something as robust as informed consent and having a fully conceptualized intent on their goal, and that seems to be too high a threshold. I'm not even sure some humans would meet that threshold. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but and so if as long as we don't mean that, then I think we're probably in safer waters. And if we're coming to, okay, so part of it is, okay, well, we want to see an absence of coercion or duress, right? That seems
Yes,
right. So,
yes.
the animal shows through his or her reactions that they don't want to do what they're doing. They sit down, right? Try to put a leash on a cat, the cat just sits there, right? Doesn't want to do it. And or that signs of that they're in pain or some other kind of distress, we can pick up on those. We can, those are seems pretty reasonable. Now maybe some harsher critics might say we're anthropomorphizing somewhat, and maybe we are, but there's still pretty clear signs that I think are common sense enough that, okay, the animal doesn't want to do this. The animal's in pain. The animal is showing signs of some kind of duress or distress. And so absent.
Yeah, and we don't have to anthropomorphize because we have science.
Mhm.
We can one there's been a lot of recent research on dogs, for example, and they've been looking at different training methods.
Mhm.
So even though the behavior that you might get um, is the exact same thing. So asking your dog to sit, for example, you can do that in lots of different ways. You can lure your dog with a piece of food. You can push your dog's butt down. You can shock your dog until he sits and then take the shock away. You can do all kinds of things. But to know whether the animal is in duress or why the animal is volunteering a behavior, um, we can we can do things like, and researchers have done this, they have tested the saliva for cortisol levels,
Hmm.
which is a stress hormone, right? So, and they found that higher levels of cortisol um, in dog saliva correlates with certain kinds of training. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a shift away from force-based training that's actually in a lot of competitive obedience and other arguably, well, I guess you could call them dog sports, some of them, to force-free training.
Mm-hmm.
The dogs they're happier, they're volunteering to do behaviors more often because they're rewarded for repeating certain behaviors. So I do take that up as an issue in the paper a little bit because I think this is part of where we get into some problems with the institutions and culture surrounding these practices. So with horse racing and greyhound racing, for example, you have a lot of issues with the training methods that are used. If you look at any replay at the end of a horse race, you see the jockeys really, um, you know, whipping the horses to run faster.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know that I mean, I'm not a horse and I am not a horse person, but I don't know that a horse enjoys that part of horse racing, even if they do enjoy running very fast or, competing in a race. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at when I'm trying to distinguish between good examples of animals engaged in sports and bad examples of animals engaged in sport.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and that makes sense to me at that level of voluntary, where we're looking for the absence of these signs of duress and stress and so on, and looking for the more um, mm, natural, voluntary expression, spontaneous expression
Yeah.
of a willingness to, well, of a showing of those behaviors, and and that they could have done differently in that aspect, right? That it's not just a stimulus response, and that with no real options going on, but that they could have done this or they could have done that, or a whole range of activities, or a whole range of responses. And so there's some sense of the animal moving towards one rather than another, and doing so absent of external coercion or duress would seem to
Mm-hmm.
suggest, that it's a voluntary behavior, at least at that level, right? Without having to bring in, conceptualization and purposive, a lot of other stuff that might involve much more intense cognitive stuff that is harder to differentiate
Yes.
and to
Yeah.
determine. But with, certainly when we're talking about animals like dogs and some other mammals and so on, that it that seems much more straightforward for us. I mean, when we start talking about fish, and maybe some birds, it now part of it may be that they're not mammals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we as mammals relate more to other mammals, and we can kind of recognize behaviors and patterns, um, in mammals that we just don't pick up in other animal species, because we just don't have a way of relating. I don't. I have no idea if that's true. It seems reasonable that we would do that. So we're not looking necessarily for informed consent or anything like that when we're talking about this voluntary play. We're looking for a more of a spontaneous reaction from the dog or from the animal, that's absent coercion or duress. Is that a good way to think about it? All
Yes,
right.
but I do want to point out that, I mean, this concept of voluntariness can also be, or I'm not sure if you want to say that's the concept, but anyway, let me start over. The motivation in animals can be conditioned, of course.
Yeah.
So it's not as if, so if you're talking about agility, for example, it's not as if you take your dog and put him out on an agility course and he immediately starts jumping over the barriers with the right technique and everything.
Sure.
There's a pretty intense and precise training that has to happen for your dog to learn how to navigate the obstacles safely, and to do it in a way that actually conforms with the rules, for example. Um, and those are all things that are learned. That's all learned behavior by the dog, and then also by the handler. I mean, this is, one of my biggest challenges is trying to figure out how I don't fall down when I'm trying to show my dog
Right.
where to go next and navigate the course appropriately. So um, I think that's one of the problems with animal philosophy, is that we tend to conceptualize animal interests in these kind of narrow ways. So while it certainly is the case that animals are not interested in voting, right?
Right.
But they might be interested in doing lots of different things. And um, one of the things that they seem to be interested in almost universally, though I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, is that they're interested in having fun and playing and making games continue. They really, and animals enjoy that, from cows to chickens to dogs and horses. They enjoy doing fun things and having that activity continue.
Right. Huh. Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I in my anecdotal experience, I can relate to that. Certainly with the animals that I've been around. Although, it, I guess I haven't been around chickens per se enough. I mean, but I'm trying to think of the birds. Uh, we have a lot of bird feeders around our
mhm,
house, and so we get all these finches and cardinals and grackles and hawks and stuff. And I'm trying to think, okay, so they jump around a lot, they chase each other. Then, and I guess it's easy to think that the chasing is a sexual behavior.
uh-huh,
And that tends to be my assumption when I see a couple birds flying around after each other. That's
uh-huh.
some sort of sexual thing or mating process. But I suppose that depending on the time of year, maybe I'm right. Depending on another time of year, it's not. It's a playful activity.
Right.
Or it could be at least. I mean, that's because they definitely do things that look like they could be described as a playful activity, something that's fun, just kind of playing a game of chase, to so to speak. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I mean, I guess. Um, and cows. Cows have that's I guess I don't know. I mean I'm a city boy. Well, no, I'm not a city boy. I'm a suburb boy. So, um, what kind of examples of cows playing? I'm kind of intrigued by that.
Cows. I don't know the name of the study off the top of my head, but cows really enjoy problem solving. So they've
Huh.
done this research on cows, and they found that they actually have best friends and form these bonds with each other, which is also kind of interesting. But they did an experiment where they created like a box, and if the cow touched, and there were these buttons on the box, and the cows had to touch the buttons. I think it became increasingly more complicated. So there was a sequence or something, but first they just had to push the push the button with their, I don't remember if it was their nose or their hoof, and it released a little bit of food. And the cows that were playing this game with this box that dispense treats for getting it right, for hitting the correct button, would, I mean, they would kind of dance around the field after they were done. It was really sort of interesting. Um, behavior that the cows were, and they all the cows kept coming up and trying the box over and over again.
Interesting.
So yeah, it is really interesting. And you talked about chickens, and I feel compelled to mention Bob and Marion Bailey, who are very well known animal behaviorists, and they have these things called chicken camps, where trainers go to these chicken camps and they get a chicken and they learn how to teach the chicken all of these elaborate behaviors.
Huh.
So the chickens learn these different things that they, and if you can train it, the idea is that if you can train a chicken to run and touch a button and then run back, or to help recognize a puzzle piece or something and point to, they've shown that these chickens can recognize shapes and then attach them to verbal cues. So if you have a chicken and you say, find the triangle, the chicken will find the triangle in all of these different shapes on pieces of cardboard that are lying around.
That's
and they
crazy.
do it pretty accurately. Yeah. So it's, so the idea is if you can train a chicken, you can train lots of different animals. So
Even a 5-year-old?
yeah, I suppose. No, I don't have any experience with that, but yeah.
Well, I have a 5-year-old, but I don't have very good experience in training it. I'm sensing a theme here. I haven't trained my dog well, so they train us, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, they definitely do.
So, well, that's really interesting, and something definitely worth looking more into. But I wanted to move forward a little bit into, so you have a taxonomy of sport, of animal sports. Maybe you could say something briefly about the limited taxonomy that you present, or that you're going to focus on in your paper.
So at the moment, I only have two categories, though one is divided into two subcategories. And so the first category is animals as opponents.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the sports where animals directly oppose other animals or humans in competition. So, and this is the one with two subcategories. So the first subcategory is animals versus human beings. So one example you have here is bullfighting. Another example would be like alligator wrestling,
Uh-huh.
or, um, sometimes you see, a human being that races a cheetah, or, those are really sports, as bullfighting, which has a rich history and, culture surrounding it.
Right.
But that sort of falls under that subcategory. And the
Now,
second subcategory would be animals versus other animals. So greyhound racing, cockfighting, and dogfighting, for example.
okay. And then, so things like fishing and hunting, or would you categorize, to the extent that we think of those as sports even, those would be in the animals versus humans
Yes.
type category?
Yes.
Um, so I guess one question is, well, okay, that would maybe getting ahead of us, but uh, there does seem to be something about knowing that you're a part of the competition, or at least having some.
Yeah.
Whereas that's one of my concerns with things like fishing and hunting, is that the opponent doesn't necessarily know they're an opponent. They're just kind of like,
Exactly.
oh, hello, and so whereas to a degree, maybe in the bullfighting or the greyhound racing, I mean, there's some sense, I don't want to attribute too much cognitive awareness here, but
Mm-hmm.
unnecessarily, but there's some sense that there's a different activity here, that there's an activity going on that's normal, that's different than a normal activity, where I don't think the deer has that when, it's just
Right.
so. But maybe we'll get more into that as
Well,
s-
you brought up informed consent,
mm,
right? And I know this is problematic, but I think this might be a place where some version of a concept of informed consent would be helpful, right? Because um, like you, if you were a deer, would you consent, in some way to being hunted, right? I mean, the resounding answer is, well, no, I wouldn't consent to that. And
Right.
if it meant my death, right? Maybe if I were properly weaponed up, then that would be different. But it's not a, it's certainly not fair in this, and similarly to bullfighting, it's not fair. But that's a whole other issue. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring that up. So,
No, I think that
but
that's a key. That is important. I mean, how you want to try to cash out what sort of variant on informed consent you could have for animals. That's an interesting thing. But you might have some sort of hypothetical
yeah,
question. The sort of stuff that you might see in some of like the social contract and contractarian type theories, where abstract away and think, okay, what would a reasonable being consent to,
yeah,
and so things like greyhound racing or horse racing or dog agility seems like that just in the pure competition aspect of it, that a reasonable being might say, yeah, that might be fun. But yeah, hunting, fishing, bullfighting,
yeah, right.
it's harder to see how one would make that kind of choice absent coercion. And one thing that struck me here is even thinking about human versions of these activities, something like the Hunger Games, right?
Yes.
I mean, thankfully that's a fictional example, but we do have in the history, accounts that are, at least as far as I understand, non-fictional examples of using human beings as a kind of prey in a hunt. Um,
Mhm.
I think that there was some practice of that in the South around the Civil War or pre-Civil War and stuff like that. Maybe those are more uh, apocryphal tales of those activities. But um, I remember reading what was it? I think it's Where the Red Fern Grows. I think that came up in that book. But having African Americans as the prey and people go out and hunt them down, and so
Yeah.
that strikes me, in the Hunger Games example as a fictional example, as running parallel to your argument about why some animal sports might not be sports, might also fit for why the Hunger Games might not count as, or Running Man might not count as sport either.
Yes.
Would so maybe we come to that. Why do oh well the other category of animal sports you had is animal as teammates. Maybe you could say something about that, and then
Yes.
we'll talk about the what disqualifies things as animal sport.
Yeah. So animals as teammates is the second category that I have at the moment. And in these sports, animals work together with human teammates that's toward a common goal. So this would include cases like horse racing, even fox hunting, though that would also kind of overlap with animals as opponents.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and polo, dressage, dog agility, all of these things where it's the the animal. You could clearly argue that the animal is an athlete in this endeavor, but they have a human as a teammate that is doing the sporting activity with them.
Right. Yeah, and in terms of only having these categories, I I can't really think of anything else that isn't covered by your taxonomy. So I think it's a pretty good taxonomy. I'm having trouble thinking of any examples that would fall out of any of your categories here. Certainly, if any listeners have any ideas, let us know. Sportsethicist@gmail.com, and so that would certainly help you and help all of us. Maybe if we're missing something here, but I think that's pretty exhaustive. It's hard to think of anything else that wouldn't fit into those categories.
Well, there is sort of the matter of using animals as equipment.
Okay.
So one example that I found recently is it's called cricket spitting, and that's
Cricket
pretty.
spitting? Is it?
Cricket spitting, which is pretty much just what it sounds like. The crickets are usually dead, usually being the operative word. Then people load them into their mouths and see who can spit the cricket the farthest. Um,
People have way too much time on their hands.
yeah. So, but that's not within the scope of this particular project. But that
Yeah,
it is something worth mentioning that animals are present in sports in lots of different ways. And
yeah.
one of the things I've looked at before is using animals as mascots and what are some issues that might arise from that.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, but with regard to animal sports in particular, where animals are kind of conceptualized as quote unquote athletes, um, yes, I would stick to those two categories.
Yeah. And so then you want, I take it you want to argue that there's some condition that needs to be met in order for it to be an animal sport, and things that are just not sport. That there might be, there's something that looks something like a sport, but it's not. It's just not sport. And so what is that condition? What is it that we're looking for that would make an animal sport that not be an animal sport?
So sports or so activities that are not sport, I want to say, are those that violate this condition of voluntary play in the goal of the sport or game that's happening. So, for example, with bullfighting, it has a culture, it has all of these different practices around it. However, the animal athlete, the bull in this case, um, and you can't argue, you cannot reasonably argue that the bull wants to be there, that he wants to be stabbed over and over again. And that is the goal of a bullfight,
Mm,
to bring the bull down before time runs out. There's no possible way that a bull would volunteer for that, even in all of its majesty and all of the things, its behavior in the ring and trying to vanquish its opponent. It's not. The goal is to defeat the bull in a way, which involves killing it.
all right.
And the same goes for cockfighting and dogfighting. I think those cannot be considered sports because the very goal of the endeavor involves injury, tremendous fear, and usually death. So those animals that are competing in those activities cannot possibly be volunteering or playing at all in those contexts.
Okay. Um, Certainly where the goal is death, uh, I agree. I'm not as sure where injury is a part of it. So if we remove, and maybe in some context, I don't know enough about um, cockfighting or dogfighting to know um, how these things proceed. But if so, for example, I'm thinking of, again, trying to think of it. So Hunger Games is not a sport because the goal is to survive your death, right? Or
Yeah.
not survive your death, but not to die in the process. And
Right.
the person who wins is the one who doesn't die. Everybody else dies. And so Mulligan's not a fan clearly, but and that's a so I think that disqualifies it, right? So where death is not only a possible consequence from engaging in the activity, something like mountain climbing, but is in some sense the goal of the activity, then yeah, it's not really,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like play anymore. And but I'm less sure about injury because things like boxing or MMA and wrestling and football, uh,
Yeah.
these things involve a tremendous amount of risk of injury that's quite foreseeable and expected in the contest. And that doesn't seem enough to say that those aren't sport. Now, we may call into question
Right.
whether or not we want to participate in them, but they still seem like sport. So what would be the difference with the now? Maybe it's one thing I was thinking of is that maybe the difference is that that once you sort of start, the cockfight or the dogfight in those conditions, that that it's almost I don't want to say impossible, but it's very unlikely that you would be able to uh, prevent the death from or significant injury from occurring. That there's no real way to protect the participants in the way that we try to do in those human fighting sports.
Right.
Is that a possible way of differentiating between the two?
Um, I think so, but I also think that this is where the idea, however we want to conceptualize it, the idea of motivation comes into play.
Okay.
So, for example, in dogfighting, the dogs, when they're pitted against each other, they fight out of fear. They're attacking each other out of fear. Same with cockfighting. And in those cases, especially in cockfighting, the talons are replaced on, roosters have these very sharp talons, but
Mm-hmm.
they get spurs put on them. They're sort of like boxing gloves, but and they actually have boxing gloves without the spurs, but they have these very sharp spurs, so that when the rooster climbs on top of the other rooster and grabs with his talons, he stabs the other rooster. And
Right. Okay.
the talons are quite deep, and they have to be swabbed beforehand because people can put poison on them
Oh,
to make the
jeez.
bird go down faster, things like that. So, while someone, might be an MMA fighter and have, reasons for participating in this activity, um, when animals are participating in these activities, they're doing so not because it's fun or because they get $1 million at the end or a whole jar of peanut butter all to themselves or something like that. They're doing it out of fear.
Okay.
Um, so that's one reason why I'm sort of hanging on to this idea of voluntariness and motivation.
Yeah. No. Whoop. Everything okay?
Yep.
Okay.
The Chihuahua needs to come out, so she's sitting on my lap right now. So.
Okay.
Sorry.
They're getting excited about dogfighting. They want to contribute and have their say in
Yeah.
here. Yeah, because it seems like the way you're describing it that these activity that the animals are in some ways under duress. That they're not. It's sort of
Yeah.
like taking two people and say, okay, now you guys have to go fight, and if you don't, we're going to hurt you. And so the people might
Yeah.
fight, but that's not what we see when we're talking about MMA or these things. That
Right.
people are engaging it for different kinds of motivations. They're not under duress, at least once you're a professional at that point. I mean, you can imagine things on the sides and in back alleys and stuff that might be like that, but that's obviously not what we're talking about. And and
Right.
and so it's now maybe you could create some scenario where the dogfighting didn't have those characteristics, but it seems kind of unrealistic that the dogs typically don't want to fight unless they're forced to fight. Whereas humans, we might enjoy the process of the fight for whatever reason, um, and uh, and so it does seem different at that point when we're talking about something like boxing versus dogfighting. It does seem, I think you're right to look um, at least trying to read the motivations in some ways, right? In terms of trying to see, to what extent are they engaging in this because of positive reasons in a sense rather than negative reasons. Um,
Right. Right.
so basically that lack of voluntariness, that lack of voluntary play is what disqualifies something as a sport. And I think that fits too for human things like we were saying, like something like a Hunger Games or Running Man type scenario, that those aren't sport, because they're not play anymore, because it's too serious. There is no
Yeah.
non-serious element to it when your life is in the balance. Um, And okay, so then once we get into things that are still, can pass the voluntary question, uh, what's the difference between things that are good examples and bad examples of sport?
Um, this goes back to this idea of coercion and using force to compel behavior. Um, so good examples of animal sports have these virtually absent from them. The animal is performing the behaviors that are asked of them in the sporting context. They're doing so because they will be rewarded after they complete the behavior. Um, they You see these examples where the sorry
That's okay.
the animal has a close bond with their handler. The bad examples come, and I'm not entirely. I'm trying to distinguish between bad practices that can exist anywhere, right? So I really like to think of dog agility as a great example of animal sport.
Hmm.
A lot of emphasis is on fun for the dog, fun for you, learning new skills, like all these great things. But of course, you can have bad practices.
Hmm.
So, one example would be I had a friend who was training at a facility with her dog, and she observed the trainer who was working with another team, and this other handler was sending her dog over a jump, but the dog really was interested in a lot of different things in the ring. So the the handler had attached a shock collar to the dog, and anytime the dog went to do anything other than go over the jump, it would get shocked. Now that's a bad practice, I think.
Hmm.
It creates stress for the animal. Um, the animal is compelled via a painful experience, right, through positive punishment, then then out of kind of wanting to do the activity because it's a jumping over things is fun, and I'll get rewarded afterwards. So that's a bad practice, but I don't know that that's necessarily that sort of disqualifies dog agility as being a bad example of animal sport.
Hmm.
Rather, I'm thinking of some of these problems that we have in horse racing, for example, where the horses have been bred to be very large but have very delicate bone structures. So that's why you see so many professional racehorses with broken legs and things like that. There's a lot of steroid allegations and things like that that seem to be sort of present in the entire culture that I think we could safely say, like, again, we have this sort of threshold problem, right? How much is too much to say that the whole sport is, there's something wrong with it,
You're right.
right?
Well, partly,
Um,
I mean, you can deal with that by saying, okay, well, if can we remove that element from the sport and still have the sport recognizable and all the good parts of it still there? And I think
right.
you can in horse racing, right? I mean, you could maybe
Yeah, you could.
you could breed the horses in ways that maybe make them a little bit safer. You can
Mm-hmm.
you can remove some of the dangerous substances that might be being used, dangerous training methods,
Mm-hmm.
as you're talking about, and you can still have horse racing.
Yeah,
Whereas maybe in the dogfighting example, you really can't.
you
Like it,
can't.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And similarly with human sports too, right?
exactly.
There's lots of sports that have some pretty bad cultures in them, and where there's a lot of the stuff that you're just talking about with horse racing that seems like it's also in human sports, and
Mm-hmm.
so that yeah, and that's more of a criticism of the practices surrounding the sport rather than the sport itself. Whereas the dog fighting and the cockfighting and those kind of things, that those the concern is within the activity itself, not just how you
Right.
might go about it. And so 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 then the distinction then between bad sports and good sports might fall in that way, and sort of how much of the practice is built upon or needing where we're no longer is it basically we're able to meet the condition of voluntariness, but we're not necessarily uh, um, meeting it. How do I want to say this? Maybe you can help me out because I'm thinking, okay, so something like a greyhound
So,
racing. Okay, go ahead. You go ahead.
oh, so we might be meeting the condition of voluntariness, but for the wrong reasons.
Okay, good.
And
That's what I was trying to
and
say.
yeah, I'm one of the things I'm really hoping to say is that these reasons are important, and we need to pay attention to those when we are um, when we're dealing with non-human animals in these sporting contexts and hopefully elsewhere too. Um, I think that the reasons like I said before, with getting your dog to sit, there's lots of different ways you can go about getting that behavior.
Right.
But we need to keep asking these questions: is this what are the reasons why the animal is performing the behavior, and is there a less invasive way of getting that behavior and getting it reliably? Um, and that's what um, a lot of dog trainers are starting to ask now. There's this trend now on YouTube called the Trainer Transparency Challenge. And so you have these trainers that are going on and talking about, they're basically they're answering three questions. So, what will happen to my dog when my dog gets something right? And what will happen to my dog when my dog gets something wrong?
Hmm.
And is there a less invasive way of making him or her get it right? And so the challenge is that if a trainer can't answer those things, or keeps it a secret, or doesn't really know, or say, well, it depends on the dog, like, then consumers need to be careful about that, because we should know what happens when we're dealing with animal behavior. And to not know, it creates a lot of problems. So
Right.
yeah, so sorry, I went off topic topic there a little bit, but I do think understanding the motivations and the reasons why animals are performing the behaviors that we ask of them is really important.
Yeah, I think so, and that's why I'm really looking forward to reading the paper when it's complete, at some point within 6 months,
Yeah.
right? And but that's all the time, actually more than the time that we have, and so we did go a little bit over, but thank you so much for sharing your ideas on this really interesting topic.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
This has been the Sports Ethics Podcast. You can find us at sportsethicist.com, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.